Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Nothing much to report. It's only been 2 days since the last episode, and I'm trying to get into the swing of this 2 shows a week schedule, which is either not frequent enough to keep me in a real rhythm or too frequent to balance with all the other stuff I've got going on. But that's my esoteric cross to bear, you know? Anyway, let's just get to the show. Author, English professor, and hardcore comics reader Jonathan W. Gray joins the show this time around. We have conflicting accounts of how we met, but the upshot is that we once hit it off at some sort of event, and I got his card and added him to the great spreadsheet that knows all. That was a couple of years ago, but recently past guest Eddie Portnoy suggested I get Jonathan on the show, and now that I'm back to recording with new guests post the COVID check-in world, here we are. Jonathan does not have a new book or project immediately coming out to talk about, and his bio will give you a very good idea of why it makes so much sense for him to be on this show and why we had one of the greatest nerd out sessions I have ever recorded. So let's just get to it. As far as caveats go, his mic is a little muffled. It's yet another regret that I didn't get to do my first podcast in person with this guy instead of having to do it remotely. Now, here's Jonathan's bio. Jonathan W. Gray is Associate Professor of English at John Jay College, CUNY, and the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of Civil Rights and the White Literary Imagination, University Press of Mississippi, and is currently working on the book project Illustrating the Race, Representing Blackness in American Comics, which traces depictions of African Americans in comics from 1966 to the present by investigating how the twin notions of illustration, the creative act of depiction, and the political act of bringing forth republic consideration, function in these texts. Professor Gray co-edited the essay collection Disability in Comics and Graphic Novels for Palgrave Macmillan, and formerly served as the founding editor of the Journal of Comics and Culture. Professor Gray's journalism on pop culture has appeared in The New Republic, Entertainment Weekly, Medium, and Salon.com. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Jonathan W. Gray. I generally start for the last couple of months by asking people, how are you holding up? Which I know is an insanely broad question, but pandemic and everything else, I may as well start there with you. Jonathan, how are you holding up?
It's as best as could be expected. Me and my wife and my kids in an apartment. There have been some frustrating moments. There have been some fun moments, but it's actually been pretty quotidian and boring for the most part, thankfully.
That's better than drama and excitement,
right,
as we're learning.
Yeah.
So tell me about comics and the project you've got that you're working on, or at least that I saw you were working on representing blackness in in American comics. Where do comics start for you, and what does the project entail?
So I'm going to sound
two very different questions.
No, of course. So I'm going to sound old when I say this, but I feel like my like I came about at this wonderful moment in when it comes to comics, and I feel like everyone feels like their childhood was special, and it's a bit of a cliche, but I sort of came of age reading Chris Claremont's X-Men, which then
God damn it, Claremont and Byrne X-Men was my thing too. That was where how old are you?
I think we're the same age. I am 49.
I'm 49 also. Okay, you and I are
Yeah.
We're gonna have a very fun conversation.
Right, and so I came in initially looking at like Claremont, and actually Dave Cockrum, and then soon John Byrne's X-Men. Then that morphed into looking at reading Frank Miller on Daredevil and Walt Simonson's Thor and Marv Wolfman and George Perez's New Teen Titans, and then the one that really messed me up, which is Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. And I remember the issue where it's the first issue I picked up. I picked it up because I was young and I liked Firestorm, and Firestorm was on the cover. And I was like, what is Firestorm doing on the cover of this Swamp Thing? And I opened the issue, and it was Roots, which has a couple of, obviously, as a young black kid, it has a couple of connotations for me. But I still, to this day, there is a house above the world where the over people sit. There is a man with wings like a bird. There is a man who can look across the planet and wring diamonds from its anthracite. And I was just like, what? And so that changed me in terms of like, oh, this is something that I am never going to be done with. Right. And so that was definitely that was like a seminal moment for me. I was already around all of these comics, which are, 20 and 30 and 40 years later. It's like, oh yeah, Claremont's X-Men, Byrne on Fantastic Four, Simonson on Thor. These are already iconic runs, but the Alan Moore Swamp Thing just floored me, and I've been in love ever since.
Did you unfortunately, like me, find that Alan Moore influenced your writing style too much in a horrible pastiche kind of way, or were you able to escape that influence as a teenager?
So the two things that really shaped my sensibility were comics and hip hop, right? And so because of that, and so because hip hop is pastiche as well, right? So we're getting a snippet of James Brown and a snippet of the Beatles and a snippet of this and a drum machine, and so it all just made sense to me, but not in a way that I felt I needed to necessarily imitate it. It was just like, oh, well, this is pastiche and this is pastiche and this is highly referential and this is also highly referential. And it was, for me, what the fun part was, sort of digging for what the references and the allusions were all about, right? Whether it was Public Enemy making a reference to like some black Marxist essay, or it was Alan Moore making a reference to like Robinson Crusoe. Like, wait, hold on, what is this reference? Like, what's going on here? And so just trying to assemble and make sense of it all, that was sort of my constant hobby, back in the good old days.
Yeah. Well, Thomas Pynchon was introduced to me by Alan Moore. That was an issue of V for Vendetta was the first mention of Pynchon that I saw when I was 16 and thought, right. Guess I should look at that. And
exactly.
Yeah, we have all those gateway drugs, I suppose.
Right. It's like, for me, it was Nietzsche, right? So I remember, reading Watchmen and being like, the abyss gazes also like, well, what is this? And it's just like, then I started reading, Thus Spoke the Spake Zarathustra, which I was like, ugh, okay. But then when I got to college, actually started reading like the more philosophical Nietzsche and the less mystic Nietzsche, and was like really like, oh, okay, this is what Alan Moore was getting me ready for, right? And so like for me, like when I encountered like Foucault and Derrida, I was like, duh, I've been doing this forever,
The one, by the way, oddball superhero built on remix mentality comic that nobody seems to have read but me, Grant Morrison's Zenith. Any background in that?
I never read that. No. Like it's funny.
I will get you. Yeah.
No, I was going to say the only Grant Morrison I read at the time was Animal Man. Then unfortunately, I started reading interviews of him, and he just sounded so pompous. I was like, oh God, okay, I'm good.
Oh yeah, there's that. But this is basically a superhero comic he did in the UK for 2000 AD that was all
Oh,
pastiche.
oh wow.
Everything is a reference to something else, but
Mhm.
not in a hyper philosophical dickish way. Basically, the lead super being is a spoiled teen pop star who's
Mm.
starting to go to seed, but is also the most powerful being on earth. So yeah, it's anyway. I'll zap you links about it because it's one of those things where I love it. Nobody else has ever read it, so I figure maybe down the line you and I can have a conversation about that too if you
I'll give it a look.
fall into Zenith.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, no, I'll
because
definitely give it a
seriously,
look.
you'll see references to everything like inverted. There's an X-Men Proteus reference. There's all these
Mm.
oddball things that are tweaked into the plot that are.
Mhm.
I mean, his explicit goal was to be the hip hop of comics. With that, his whole thing was to sample everything
Right.
deliberately into
Right.
this sort of mix. But anyway, but when it comes to the representing blackness in comics, outside of Storm in those early X-Men's, do you have an early experience of seeing black figures or characters? Or am I
So,
jumping the gun on your
no.
progression with this stuff?
No, 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 you're not at all. So the issue of Storm where and it's actually something I write a lot about in my chapter on Storm and Black Panther. But the issue of Storm, the Claremont Byrne X-Men, where she goes back to Harlem and she's like sort of walking through Harlem, and then
Mm, yeah.
she arrives at the like the brownstone where she was born, and she's trying to like make sense of herself as an African American in a weird kind of way, even though she spent most of her time on the continent, but she's actually born in Harlem. So she's trying to make sense of all of that, and then in the middle of this sort of reverie, she gets jumped, and then Luke Cage and Misty Knight show up. And so for
Mhm.
me, it was like I was like, oh, okay, so there's more, right? Um,
Yeah.
and then my older cousin, had a huge he had a huge TV box full of comics that I would just like flip through.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the comics in there, or one he had like the run of Jungle Action comics. And so like the first time I
Mm.
ever saw Black Panther was the McGregor Black Panther, which, it was the perfect age for me to
Mm.
encounter him because it was cool and interesting and political at a moment when I'm like listening to Public Enemy and I'm listening to KRS One and Rakim and and reading X-Men and thinking about I just read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and so it was all part of a stew, and I came across Jungle Action, and it's one of those things where because it wasn't a box where it was like neatly organized. It was a mess, and so I think I read them
Mhm.
out of order. But but it was just like, oh, Killmonger and Black Panther, and like this guy's like he has duty to this, and this, oh, Killmonger's clearly a black revolutionary, but he's going about it the wrong way, and thinking about like Jomo Kenyatta and like Kenya and how Kenya was supposed to be this utopian nation, but then got undone in part by British intelligence. So I had like, sort of a lot of half-formed thoughts, and sort of encountering Jungle Action at that moment was good. I was like, oh, okay, cool, right? And so it wasn't until later when I was like, I actually don't think I read the full run of Jungle Action from beginning to end until I was in my 40s. But I just remember reading like two or three issues of it and seeing like the seriality of it, and two, like one of them had to be a Killmonger issue where I was like, oh, okay, this guy is fighting for independence, and he hates the monarchy that Black Panther represents, and there was enough there that it sort of struck me and stuck with me.
Mm. Were you trying to pursue it academically in terms of, subject matter for stuff you were working on?
Not at all.
Because I remember in that era, it was not something you could pursue, and I didn't know if you had,
No. So
those sort of aims either.
one of the funny things that I did was in when I was in 11th grade in high school, my high school teacher wanted us to bring poetry from home, right? To sort of,
Mm.
encourage us to like find something from home that has poetry in it, that's like, poetry of your life. And so I actually brought in I think the first or the second Etrigan the Demon Swamp Thing issue.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was like, well, here you go. This is rhyme and meter and verse, and here it all is right here. And she's like, oh, this is really cool. Can I borrow this? And I'm like, sure. So I came back the next day and I was like, oh, can I have my comic back? And she was like, it's gone. And so someone else had stolen the comic. I mean, I'm fairly sure my English teacher didn't keep it. I'm fairly positive someone came from a different class and was like, "Oh, this is cool," and just snatched it off her desk. So that was like,
and there are those things that burn our ass when we're teenagers. That,
oh
now
my
we
God.
could just spend the $2.50, but at the time that was, I'll never replace that. I can't find that issue. Yeah,
exactly. I had to negotiate. Like my dad always encouraged me. This is the one thing where he every Saturday or every other Saturday he would bring me to the comic shop, and so I would get my books. And I think he was just happy that I was always a voracious reader. So, we would go, it's funny because we would go to Walden Books so I could pick up Lord of the Rings, or, we're the same age, so you know Walden Books, right?
It was my first job.
Oh, no.
The first place I ever worked.
I could have never. But anyway, so he would bring me to Walden Books, and I would grab like a Piers Anthony or, a Lord of the Rings, or I'd grab something. But I was also grabbing like Langston Hughes collections and like Malcolm X and different things. But I was also always grabbing comics. And then it's one of those situations where I was like, whoa, I'm missing this issue of X-Men. Where's this issue of X-Men? And the guy's like, oh, we don't have it. It must have sold out here, but you should go down to the comic shop. I was like, wait, what? Right. And so then it was like the comic shop, and that became the thing. And the idea of back issues, right? And just like so he would just drop me off and like pick me up 2 hours later. But I honestly feel like this is where, and The Simpsons has made a part of their industry off of mocking Comic Book Guy. But but part of like learning to like sort of think on your feet and argue, it's like, well, who would win, Daredevil or Batman? Oh, well, Daredevil would win because and then you spend a half an hour arguing it out with this random person,
right?
And it winds up being kind of.
And there's
funny.
Always Hulk versus Thor, Hulk versus the Thing. We always had our So now, where did you grow up? Where did you?
So I am from New Haven. But
okay.
I am from town and not gown. So
gotcha. I've only made 2 trips up there, both to Yale to record a podcast, and then go to Harold Bloom's memorial last January. So
okay.
And it's one of those I've been to the city. I don't really know what it is or where it is. This is I drive up 95, stop, and that's
well, right. This is everyone's relationship. Not everyone. Many people's relationship with New Haven is, predicated on this is the exit, these are the turns I take, and now I've arrived at Yale. And I park in the parking garage, and I spend the day, or if you spend more than one day, there's a hotel right there, and you never go out into the neighborhoods. New Haven is a majority black city, and it is incredibly impoverished. And quite deliberately so by the practices of the university, which they don't pay property tax because they're older than the country. And so when you think about like schools and roads and all the things that property tax is supposed to pay for, and you see the relationship now that Yale has, and there's a couple of private schools, and that's where all the Yale professors send their kids. They live in, Cheshire and Guilford. They don't actually live in New Haven, or there's one part of New Haven where they do live, right? It's actually quite nice. It's very, very fancy. But of course, all their kids go to private school. They would never send their kids to the city schools because why, right? And so I grew up in Newhallville, which is, the easiest way to say it is if you're familiar with New York, Yale has a relationship to the rest of New Haven similar to Columbia's relationship to the rest of Harlem, but worse.
I was just thinking that the way you were describing it, because of the eminent domain, the blighting, and all that stuff, where they just kept grabbing more land as they could. But,
yep.
Yeah. Everything's a real estate scam. That's my primary lesson of 50 years on this planet. That a lot of things can be explained by somebody profiting off real estate and profiting off of race, as it turns out, which we'll talk about extensively, I hope. But again, back to blackness in comics. You're back to the project that you're working on. How did where you started and Jungle Action kind of progress into where you are?
Right. So so I went to Howard
That's a lot of
University.
threads. I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
fine. It's fine. It's fine. So, I had I went to high school. I went to Howard University, for my undergrad. And again, there's a bunch, and again, the two things I love, hip hop and comics, there's a bunch of people there who love those same two things. So, that sort of continues there. I realized I want to, when I entered college, I knew I was either going to be a lawyer or I was going to be a college professor. So it was like, okay, so by the time I'm finishing, I'm like, well, law is not really my thing. So I wound up going to CUNY, to the CUNY Graduate Center for my PhD. And my project was actually looking at white writers and their relationship to the civil rights movement, right? And so that's my dissertation. That's my first book, is looking at white writers and how, and it's a fairly simple idea. The idea being that if the civil rights movement really changed America, then why do we act as if it only changed Black America? Right. So that's sort of the conceit of the book, is to go back and look. And so I looked at Norman Mailer, I looked at Eudora Welty and William Styron and Robert Penn Warren, and the ways that their literary output shifted from 1952 through 1968. Right. It's a fairly coherent thing. So when I got my first job, my only job, so when I got my when I luckily got a tenure track job, my chair said, "Hey, are there any classes that you want to propose?" And I had seen, in journals and, here and there, mostly because of Mouse. But I'd seen like academic articles on Mouse and academic articles on Watchmen and on Frank Miller. And I was like, hey, let's do a class on comics as literature. And of course, you never know a thing until you have to teach that thing, right? And so I quickly sort of sketched out and wrote up this class. It was really just a course description, right? Because it was sort of like, this was like March, and the class would be running in September. So I just like sort of put together a course description of what this class would look like. And I got an email from my chair, and he was like, "So your class filled in one day.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we take away a section of Survey of American Literature and give you a second section of your comics class?" And I was like, "I don't mind at all." And so that was sort of my entree in to this as a discipline. I hadn't actually ever really thought of it that way. By the time I got my PhD in 2006, and at that time there's a lot of academic work on hip hop. And actually, I'd actually written an essay for a collection on Jay-Z and Lupe Fiasco. So I'd done some work in culture, but I did work in culture there. I hadn't really seen anything aside from a couple of articles on Mouse and a couple of articles on Watchmen and a couple of articles on Frank Miller. I hadn't really seen anything sort of engaging the things that interested me, because the things that interested me were, more Swamp Thing than Watchmen, right? More X-Men than or more Daredevil than Dark Knight Returns, right? I'm like, why are people like, Daredevil's better, right? Why are people fawning over this other thing? Anyway, and so then I started teaching it, and of course, so I decided to divide the class up into three chunks. So a chunk on superheroes, a chunk on autobiographical narrative, and a chunk on what I then called like literary comics, right? And so we looked at Love and Rockets and Black Hole and comics like that weren't superhero comics, but they also weren't these professional, personal autobiographical things like Mouse or Fun Home, right? And so it's sort of gone from there.
And you become the comics guy.
Exactly.
In terms of, because I guess a professor. Oh, sorry. There's a professor at NYU who's asked me to help her put together a comics curriculum, and it's one of those. The comics I would suggest are probably not the ones you want to introduce like 18, 19-year-old kids to, and they're probably not going to have any interest in the old fogey stuff that I care about. So I'll help, but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Anyway, so your comment is interesting in part because you have to really be aware of like the politics of an English department to put it together, right? And so this is where I think a lot of people who love comics, like, oh yeah, I love R. Crumbs. Like, do not show any English professor R. Crumb. Are you
Yeah.
crazy? Right? For for any number of reasons, right? And so it's like it's those kinds of things that wind up, if you're coming in from the outside as a comics expert, you're probably right, but you have to understand that there are tracks in like post-coloniality, and there are tracks in like, gender studies and queer studies, and there are tracks in identity studies, or Latinx studies, African American studies, and so you need to have things that fit neatly into each of those tracks, right? And so it can be frustrating, but it's like actually not that hard, right? It's like, oh, okay, so Love and Rockets fits quite well right here. Oh, look, Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, boom, that fits right over here. Oh, hey, so here we have something on gender. Oh, well, that's Fun Home, right? Oh, and of course, there are any number of comics, autobiographical comics on the Jewish experience, which will fit right into like ethnic literature. So it actually becomes easy when you think like an English professor to find things that map neatly on top of it.
Sure. Now, when you were coming up, were
Mm-hmm.
there discovering cartoonists who were black when you didn't know they were black? When they were, in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Kyle Baker's the first one who jumps to mind because, I first see him in like West Coast Avengers and Spectacular Spider-Man, eventually, Why I Hate Saturn. Great.
Right.
But, even the author picture was not clear exactly about ethnicity, and a lot of other cartoonists, Dennis Cohen, guys like that, were not. It never came up. Trevor Von Eaton, these people who were Marvel and DC in that era.
Right.
It was never a thing, and there are a lot of reasons behind that. But was there an instance for you of I didn't realize, and sort of changing your impression of artists or writers?
The moment. So there were a couple of moments, right? So one moment was, and you remember this moment when suddenly the comics had the creators on the cover.
Right.
Right. So you'd walk in and you're like, oh, okay, so this is Claremont and Paul Smith. X-Men, they're on the cover, so you can see, oh, okay, right? And so once you began to, and it worked, right? It totally worked because like I followed John Byrne from X-Men to Fantastic Four, from Fantastic Four over to Alpha Flight, from Alpha Flight to Superman. I completely followed him. Oh, John Byrne's here. I got to read
the Hulk.
John. Right. Oh, I didn't like that, his run in the Hulk.
It was terrible, but you missed it. You missed it with good reason.
Yeah, no. I looked at it. So it's one of the things where I bought the first couple issues. I was like, and I sort of passed on it. But anyway, but
so the celebrity side of it,
right,
the name recognition,
right, and so you start treating those quote unquote important creators the way that you treat, Colson Whitehead or Jennifer Egan or Toni Morrison, right? You start treating them that way. Oh, there's a new book by this important person. I need to grab it. And it wasn't until Milestone that I was like, oh, I had no idea Dennis Cohen was black.
Right.
Right, because his name is not, it's Dennis Cohen spelled the way I thought he was. Comic books is
primarily Jewish.
Yeah, it's a bunch of middle class. It's a bunch of middle class Jewish guys from New York. I thought Dennis Cohen was another one of those, and then I'm like, he's black. Oh, cool. And so it's funny because Milestone comes out when I'm at Howard University, so it's like a double. I'm at the first historically black college, and I'm sitting around with a lot of important people, or people who would become important. We're just like nerdy, very earnest, very serious people at that time, and I'm going to get my fix of comics, and I'm like, oh, cool, there's this whole black line of comics. Let's go. Blood Syndicate, awesome. Static, awesome. I actually really like Zombie as well. I thought that was one that I felt hasn't really got enough love. But anyway, so the whole Milestone thing, and so then from there, knowing, oh, these are black creators, so now I can follow them, right? And so that became the way for me, to figure out who was who, and then, become aware of them and start seeking them out. But yes, and so quite honestly, I hadn't really thought seriously, although I'd been reading comics for as long as I can read. I hadn't really thought seriously about representations of race until Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, which just blew me away. And so yeah, and so that was like, you know what, there's something here. And so and I have to say this, and this is sad. This is where capitalism shapes the ivory tower more than the ivory tower wants to admit. Once my little class became a thing, I had to officially add it to the curriculum, right? So I had to do like this much more drawn out formal process. And one of the things that I said was, well, hey, look, comics are this central force in the movies. And, you know, at our university, we offer film classes. So why wouldn't you offer comics classes because of the role that they play in these blockbuster films? And so there's almost like a reverse, even though there's like a reverse engineering from, you know, hey, this professor over here teaches film, so why can't I teach comics since comics inform film? And so, yeah, and so that's sort of what got me going. But then, and of course, I'm sure you've been here where you're reading something, you're reading an assessment of a creator, and you're going, that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What? Like who? No one believes that. Like, what are you talking about? Right? And so that's the thing. When I started, you know, because again, now I'm teaching this, and I've got to read the scholarship because I'm teaching it. And so I started reading the scholarship, and I'm like, that's not right. What? No, that's not how that happened. Huh? And so the more that happens, the more, you know, you get that little itch to like intervene and do something for yourself.
And is there a sense of, if they got this wrong, how do I trust them on subject X that I'm not, you know, not as well versed in? Or is it just this kind of eliminates the possibility that their thesis holds up because they're messing the details?
Well, so what's funny is you know, and this is in the glorious world before pandemic, right? So I remember
I call it the before time.
The before time. In the before, right? So in the time before, I remember I saw, you know, so I'm doing this work and I'm putting this class together, and I saw you know, this comics academic conference at, you know, the University of Oregon, and I'm like, oh, well, let me do an abstract. Let me do something on, what did I do it on? I think I might have done it on no, you know, it was definitely it was on the evolution of Luke Cage, because at the time Luke Cage had just joined the Avengers, and this is the whole Brian Michael Bendis sort of restructuring of him, and so I like submitted this proposal for you know, for Luke Cage, and it was accepted. And so I went out to this conference not knowing anything. I mean, I'm obviously I've done my reading, but I don't really know, and I met Charles Hatfield.
Oh.
Right. So it's like, oh, hey. And so we start talking. And I met a bunch of other people, including some of the people who I was like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And so I'm like, oh, hey, hi. So, hey, how'd you get into comics? Oh, I read Mouse when I was 22.
Yeah.
And then after I read Mouse, I'm like, oh, so this is why you're making all these claims about Batman or about Wolverine or about what have you, because like this is not you know, you're coming at this from a completely different point of view, which is not a wrong place to be coming, but it's sort of like, you know, like for a while there was, you know, Germany has some of the best ethnomusicologists, but for like 5 years there were these German ethnomusicologists who were writing these books on hip hop. And it's just like, y'all need to stop doing that. Like, stop that. Like, sure, you like your technique is great and you're very erudite, but you do not know what you're talking about at a fundamental level, because you're not on the ground, right? So anyway, and so it was weird. I went from being a complete outsider, who, because of this class and because of the preparatory work to put the class together, and then showing up at this conference, and then I'm like, oh, I know as much as any of you. Well, okay, not you, Charles, but the rest of you, you know. And so that was sort of like that's how it happened.
Mm-hmm. And then evolving this into the current project.
Yeah. So as I said, the text that really pushed this into being is Kyle Baker's Nat Turner. in part because there is an academic at Columbia named Saidiya Hartman who writes about and has actually popularized the phrase, the afterlives of slavery, right? And so as someone who, my original sort of training is in African American and American studies, Hartman's work is I mean, she just got the MacArthur Genius Grant this year or last year, one of those. Recently, she got the MacArthur, right? So she's this seminal figure, and I'm reading Nat Turner. I'm like, oh my God, like this is what Saidiya Hartman is thinking about, right? But Saidiya Hartman is not going to, read 40 years of comics to be able to say something smart about Kyle Baker's Nat Turner. But I've already read 40 years of comics, so let me do that, right? And so then so this is the way the book looks. So there's a chapter on African superheroes, which is the chapter on Black Panther and Storm. Then there's a chapter on African American superheroes, which is the Falcon and Luke Cage, right? Then there's a chapter on Black history where I look at two very different books, Kyle Baker's Nat Turner and John Lewis's March, right? Which again are very, very different. But there is something in there. What connects them is this idea of like the afterlife of slavery, right? And like the notion of second-class citizens and wanting to reframe a particular kind of cultural debate, right? And then there's a chapter on representations of children, where I look at the Boondocks and I also look at Jeremy Love's Bayou. And then I have like a little coda, a little like epilogue, to use a comics term. My epilogue is on the heroic Obama, and just looking at all of the different representations of him, from Grant Morrison, speaking of, making him a Superman to the Ash versus Obama series and all the just weird different things that were going on, which I think were cynical attempts to cash in on the Obama phenomenon, but I think were also attempts to grapple with what it means that this hegemonic masculinity, which is to say the presidency, is now embodied by a Black figure. Like, what does that mean? I think that people are like, oh, they're just trying to make money. I'm like, yeah, there's something else going on here.
Yeah,
so
there's a reason it's a way to make money. There's something resonating, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
You'll know the terminology far better. So,
right.
Do you remember your first Black Panther exposure? Was it reprints of the Kirby Fantastic Fours, or was it discovering the Don McGregors a little bit later in the 70s?
Yeah, no. As I said earlier, my cousin had this refrigerator box. And in the refrigerator box was the Jungle Actions, and
I just didn't know if that was the first time you.
Yeah, no, that was definitely the first time I think I might have. It's weird because like comics is weird, right? Because like I knew who Thanos was, and then I read Infinity Gauntlet. Does that make sense? Like I didn't see the Thanos Avengers issues. But I just remember, but of course, because of First, was it First Comics that did Dreadstar?
Yeah, Eclipse or First?
Eclipse or First, whichever one did Dreadstar. Because I remember at the time, the indie comics boom with John Sable Freelance by Mike Grell and American
It began
Flag
with Epic, actually. Dreadstar was a Marvel.
Right. That's what it was. That's right.
Yeah.
That's
and then
right.
it moved over to like First or Eclipse. Yeah.
Right. And so I remember reading.
We're such nerds, man.
Oh, I know. And so I remember because now I'm going to the comic shop and the guy's like, hey man, are you up on Jim Starlin? I'm like, not really. Like, well, I know what you like. You'll probably like this too. And he points me to the first issue of Dreadstar. So I was like, oh, this is cool. And it's really a kind of fantastic world building. In a really important way. But anyway, my point being that, comics are weird in that of a character before you actually interact with that character in a way. So I don't know when I first encountered Black Panther. I knew that I knew who he was when I picked up the Jungle Action out of the box. I was aware that there was this, I might have seen him on the cover of an issue of the Avengers, but I wasn't really interested in the Avengers. I was much more interested in X-Men. So I would just skip right past those in the big refrigerator box and look for and it's the same thing, right? So it's like, yeah, I wasn't really interested in the Fantastic Four until John Byrne started writing the Fantastic Four. And then I was like, okay, they seem kind of corny to me, right? And then later on, going back and reading the Kirby Stan Lee ones, I was like, holy cow, wow, But for me, the foundational works were, again, Claremont's X-Men, Walt Simonson on Thor, Frank Miller on Daredevil, and then everything sort of went from there in terms of,
I have the double stories of Walt Simonson lives about 15 minutes away from me. I'm in northern New Jersey. He's right over the border in New York State. And we've talked about getting together, but that was in the before time. And I was once at a party. I was at a party with Frank Miller. The two of us went out to get booze for the party. And I didn't realize who he was until about 20 or 30 minutes into our conversation, when it finally hit me that, that's who he is. And
right.
Okay. So let me figure out how I'm going to reveal that I know who he is without melting down in a puddle. This is like early 2000s. It was just one of those. So, So when you say Frank, you mean you're Frank Miller. And when you mention Lynn, that's Lynn Varley. Oh, okay. So,
right. Frank and Lynn. Right.
Yeah,
sure.
I understand. So,
right.
Yeah. And I discovered then the great neutral language. Your work has meant a lot to me over the years. That's a lot better than I worship you or anything weird like that. Like if you just your work has meant a lot to me. That establishes things without coming off too stalker and creepy. But
it's so funny though,
especially because some of his later work
is terrible. But we're not gonna talk about the libertarian Frank Miller. That's
right. The post 9/11 Frank Miller, really.
There it is. Yeah, you're right about that. Post 9/11 Frank Miller. But one of the things I loved about Daredevil was it was the only comic that reminded me of rap music. Right?
Yeah.
In terms of like I picked up Batman and I'm looking at Gotham and it's like foggy and he's like swooping down from a gargoyle. I'm like, okay. I pick up Daredevil and there's a guy like with a radio on his shoulder.
I can see the panel.
Right? There's a guy with a radio on his shoulder. There's like, oh look, there's crack files on the corner, right? And I'm like, oh, this is an urban environment that's familiar to me because New Haven was really hard hit by the crack epidemic in the 1980s, and so not just the imagery from rap, but also one's lived environment, right? I'm like, oh, so this hero is actually policing a community that looks like the community that I am part of. Okay, cool. I like this better, right? So it's such an interesting, and then of course you learn that he was living in Hell's Kitchen at the time. And I'm like, oh, but I know what Hell's Kitchen was like in 1984. Holy cow, he was living in Hell's Kitchen.
Rent was cheap.
Rent was cheap, and there was lots of local color for him to draw on, based on all of that.
Now, let me ask the school where you work, the college where you work.
Yeah.
John Jay College of Criminal Justice. What does that mean? What is the student? Yeah, see, I just don't know, and I want to get an understanding given everything that's going on right now.
Yeah. So
what you do and how you fit.
Sure. So, John Jay is part of the City University of New York, and it was started it was really part of Eisenhower's push. Because you have places like City College and Hunter and Queens, which go back more than a century, and then you have places like John Jay, which were started in the 50s and 60s. John Jay and Lehman and Baruch. These schools were started basically with the idea that we have to educate more of our citizenry Like this is the whole point of CUNY, right? But that's also the point of like Sputnik, right? Like, oh my God, Sputnik, we have to fight the Russians through education. And originally the idea is, it was very much the cop college, but that's not the place that I went to work. Over the course of its 50 years of existence, or a little more than 50, maybe 60 years, I'm not really sure when it was founded. But over the course of its life, it has become a majority minority institution. So now most of the students who attend are Black and brown, and we are actually a Hispanic serving institution, right? And so that's the school so I don't know the school where it's like, oh yeah, half the people in here are off-duty cops. It's like, yeah, most people want to be lawyers. They want to go, they want to be civil servants or work with policy in some way, but they don't necessarily want to be police. Although there certainly are people who go there to become officers. But for the most part, you can get 2 years of college and then join the academy. And so because I am a tenured faculty, I really only teach like sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So I actually don't really ever interact with those students, the ones who are just there for 3 semesters and then want to join the police academy. But based on where we are now, like it is not like the stereotype of John Jay and the reality of its students are very, very different. In fact, like there was a protest if I can find it, I'll send a link. But there was a protest last semester, because it was basically like we don't want John Jay working with ICE, and we don't want John Jay supporting, so it's a typical college campus, with typical sort of non-gendered bathrooms and all of the things that like people on Fox News would think. There is this very huge and influential criminal justice faculty. A lot of them are ex-NYPD. But as an English professor, like my department isn't dramatically different than any other sort of English department. The other thing though is that I teach, and this is a weird thing about CUNY, I teach both at John Jay, that's my undergraduate institution, but I also teach graduate students at the CUNY Grad Center. And so I split my time between, I do 75% of my time at John Jay, and I do 25% of my time at the Grad Center where I work with PhD candidates. And so I have a fairly typical, mix of graduate students, right? So, it's different in that there's a major called police science, which is not something that most colleges have. And there are a bunch of like every like twice a semester, there'll be like little career fairs where you'll get, the sheriff's department from Arlington, Virginia will show up looking for people. And again, that's not something that you would get even at like a Hunter or a different CUNY. But I'm actually really curious right now, because the police are in retreat in a lot of ways, at least rhetorically, right? The idea that like, why are we spending so much money on the police? That we're actually finally having a conversation about their budget versus the budget for social workers and the budget for education. And even going back to CUNY for a second, when the pandemic hit, Cuomo was like, oh yeah, we got to cut CUNY's budget. And de Blasio's like, oh yeah, we got to cut CUNY's budget, but you're not going to cut the police. And so now it's like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't cut from these other places. Maybe we should cut from the police, right? So it's going to be really, really interesting. But yeah. Oh, and one other thing I'll say is that the current president of John Jay is Carol Mason, and she was Deputy Attorney General in the Obama administration, right? And so she's a Black woman who does work. She's a lawyer, and she did work, in the DOJ. But she's very much, progressive and a reformer, whatever that means in this very, rapidly shifting cultural moment. And so again, it's not like Sheriff Joe Arpaio is the
Yeah.
that's not what it is. So
Right. That's why I was wondering how comfortable you can be talking about police reform, just given the nature of the institution that you work for, or if it's free enough and open enough that conversation can happen.
I have tenure, so I can talk about whatever
There
I
you
want
go.
to talk about. But the other thing is, so like one of my colleagues, Philip Atiba Goff, he is a big proponent of police reform, and he's actually faculty at John Jay, right? And he was just on MSNBC with Rachel Maddow talking about all the ways that we can move the money around and make for a more equitable society, right? And so there certainly are people, who are professors at John Jay who, would not want any of that to happen. But the fact that Phil even teaches at John Jay is a sign of, where we want to be on, in all of this, right? I mean, I am actually, I think the whole abolish the police thing makes a lot of sense when you look, for example, at what happened in Camden, where they got rid of the police department and made everyone reapply, right? Every officer in Camden had to reapply for their job. And that was a brilliant way to do it because that meant that seniority couldn't, and so they weeded out a lot of the people who don't want to change, who were at the top. And, Camden has less crime and a much smaller budget than, again, per capita. Camden's a smaller community as well.
Sure.
But when you look per capita, Camden's doing something very different. And, I would be all for having, 37,000 people, okay, all you guys go and reapply for your jobs. Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people, if they were given that choice, would say, I don't even want to be bothered. And those are the people who, I think a lot of those people are the people who don't want to change, So defunding and abolishing the police, which is really about moving resources, moving money, it's kind of amazing because after 5 years with overtime, and we all know how cops love overtime, NYPD average I think $120,000 a year, right? And so like they're positioned as these blue collar working. No, they're making 6-figure salaries, right? Yeah. If you got rid of 6,000 cops at $100,000 a year, how many social workers could you hire, right? And not just that, $100,000 a year plus a fully funded pension plus some of the best health coverage, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just like, okay, so how many social workers could you hire who would take a pension at 1/3 that value, who would take health care that doesn't necessarily need to be as generous and as the packages that these officers get, right? So it's like there's just better ways to spend that money, right? And so for me, I mean, part of why I love literature, right? Comics and science fiction and Toni Morrison and, Ralph Ellison and what have you, is because they are all thinking about a different world, right? Like they're dreaming up a new reality, a different way of being in the world. So, okay, let's go, right? So, excuse me. I think that literature has a role to play precisely at this moment because we have to dream and think big.
I'm with you. And I'm assuming you've been part of the protests that have been going on? Or actually, I shouldn't assume because there might be other issues. Have you been able to participate?
So here's what's funny. So I don't know do you know the movie 13, the documentary 13?
No.
So 13th is it's about the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that ends slavery and involuntary servitude, right? And I'm actually in the documentary because I was at a Trayvon Martin protest and I was talking about the Koch brothers and Ava DuVernay, the director, who's also the director. She's going to be directing Mr. Miracle, actually. So Ava.
That gets to my final question, which we'll hold off on, but I do have a great closing question for you. Yeah.
Sure. Anyway, so she saw this clip of me talking, and she put me into the thing. And so what's really been funny is that I guess a lot of people are rewatching or watching for the first time 13. So I've been getting like one email a day from my students. Oh my God, I was watching 13 and I saw you in 13. Oh my God. You know, so I very much am interested in protests, and I typically get out there and you know, carry signs and rabble rouse and do all that stuff.
I wasn't implying anything that way.
No,
I was just concerned there might be family stuff or other issues that you just can't.
The other issue is that I have asthma.
Yeah.
And so I've got you know, a pre-existing respiratory condition. So I have been only really out once because, you know, I'm just worried about catching the virus because my lungs are not the best lungs to begin with, and if I get COVID, I'll be in deep, deep trouble.
Yeah.
So
or gassed. I mean, you can also get gassed.
Yeah. Well, the tear gas thing, that's a whole, you know, that's a whole other thing. That's just, you know, but yeah, no, I mean, but you know, going all the way back to the Million Man March, you know, yeah, protesting, definitely, always have done it. It's actually frustrating for me not to be able to get out in the streets right now because of the pandemic, which is, you know, which puts I am in a particular, you know, at risk kind of a person because of my respiratory issues.
Yeah. Now, how long have you been in New York?
Oof, 23 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Seen it change on a personal level for you? I mean, we know the hyper gentrification, et cetera, but how has your New York evolved?
I mean,
over 2+ decades.
The hyper gentrification.
Yeah, I assume that's the main factor for everything. That, like I said, the world's a real estate scam. But
oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, like my first New York apartment was 2-bedroom, 1-bath with a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen, like all separate rooms, right? And it was $700 a month, you know. So I paid $350, and my roommate paid $350, and that was my first apartment in New York, right? That building, I believe, has gone condo at this point.
Yeah.
You know, and that was way up in Harlem. This was, you know, it's like, oh, it's so expensive. I'm like, not for. I mean, I'm 6'6", right? Yeah. So it's like, yeah, there are neighborhoods I can walk around in that you can't. So I'll go to one of those neighborhoods and find a cheap place, which is what my roommate and I from Howard, what we did. You know, we were both in grad school. We had this apartment, and that was that. And yeah, it's crazy. Where it's like, oh, a 2-bedroom apartment in Harlem is $3,000. Like, what?
So I used to gauge it with the parking garages. Like, if you'd go to the Apollo, the parking garage a block north of that was pretty cheap compared to the rest of Manhattan. And I went back a few years ago, and this is creeping up. This isn't, you know, what it used to be. But now I used to be, well, Samuel Delaney, the writer.
Chip.
Yeah. Chip, yeah, we've been pals for way too long. Probably 23 years, just like you in New York.
Right.
Chip used to live in the West 80s and rent-controlled place. He ended up moving. I know he ended up moving down to Philadelphia.
Philly, yes.
A few years ago, I went by the old neighborhood a couple of months ago, and it's unrecognizable. Like everything that was the cheap Hispanic barber on the corner, the framing, all that stuff is gone. It's Malin and Getz, you know, skincare and all of this high end stuff. And it's just like, I spent so many hours sitting on the stoop with Chip and Dennis, just shooting the breeze. And this whole place is gone. Like everything is this fancy facade now. And the staircase that was like the basically like an MC Escher drawing, because you couldn't actually go straight up the stairs. All that stuff is gone now. It's this fancy building they converted it all into. But yeah, it's
Yeah, I mean, my sister used to live when I was at Howard. My sister used to live on 103rd and in Columbus, right? So literally get off the C train at 103rd and like walk 25 steps and you were at her front door. And man, so I don't know the 80s, but I know like all the little cute little shops and little bodegas and little things. And then it's now, yeah, it's like, is that a Prada store? Right. And so it was funny because you would go from, well, what is it? You go from Broadway to Amsterdam to Columbus and then Central Park West. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. And so Broadway had all the nice stuff. And then the closer you got to Central Park West, the more sort of divey and it got, which was fine. And now it's just like Broadway is all chains. It's all like, Chase Bank and CVS. Yeah. And Amsterdam is boutiques and like fancy restaurants with like, foie gras. And I'm just like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that was Chip Street. It was 82nd in Amsterdam. I think that was Chip's corner, and yeah, everything, all the gin mills and all that stuff where we used to just get shit faced and hang out, all gone.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's why you had to leave. I guess they were going to convert the building on him. But,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's been your New York experience, is really that money pushing people around.
Well, I mean, so it's two experiences, right? So I live in Brooklyn. I live in Clinton Hill, which is a fancy neighborhood now, but it's also it was for about 40 years a working class, sort of lower middle class black neighborhood. And so what you have now is you have like Google executives who bought the brownstone for $3 million cash, but that person lives next to someone whose dad bought the brownstone for $36,000 in 1972, right?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of fun to see, like on a street level, because everyone's interacting with everyone, right? And I'm that person. I'm the person who talks to everyone, right? I'm the person who's like, hey, how you doing? How are you? And so for me, it's definitely it's an interesting, like, sort of sociological experiment to talk to the people, sort of the old timers. And we've been living in this neighborhood now, where I am now. We've been here for 14 years or 12 years, or something like that. And we've been in Brooklyn for 18 years, right? So I started like many people started out in Manhattan and ended up in Brooklyn. But yeah, and so I definitely have seen the neighborhood change, but it's like, this is my neighborhood, right? And so I also have that feeling where I can tell you, oh, that restaurant, before it was a restaurant, used to be a tattoo parlor. And before it was a tattoo parlor, it was a laundromat. And then, and you have like that built-in accumulation of, the sort of accretion of experience that builds what New York means to you.
Sure. And you see yourself staying there?
I mean, so it's tricky. For me, it's tricky, because tenure is a wonderful thing in that I cannot get fired. But it also means that I am tied to this place, right? Yeah. But the thing is, and the thing that I am always aware of is the place I am tied to is New York City, as opposed to, teaching in Lincoln, Nebraska at the University of Nebraska. And the place I am tied to is Lincoln, Nebraska, right? Right. And so it's like, yeah, it could be worse. Especially for me raising a family, so raising a family in, even though the neighborhood is, again, rapidly gentrifying and vacant lot becomes building in 6 months, happening all around, it is still important to have, to raise a black family in a neighborhood where you see black people every single day, right? And not just, and so yeah. So I mean, I don't see myself. My daughter, she's like, so when can I take over the apartment? And I'm just like, you are, like, she's a freshman in college and she's already scheming to push me out and take it and make this apartment hers. I'm just like, you need to hush. So
she's got something to aspire to.
Well, yeah, well, she does. So I mean, so we're lucky. We are really, really lucky. And so we're not going anywhere, as far as I can tell.
Last question.
Yeah.
Given our overlap of experience, the comics, the age, everything else, did you get Kirby when you were a kid? Did you have to get to him later on?
Yeah, I got to him later on.
Because that 70s Kirby was not good from my side. I don't know if that was just me. So
and so this is the thing, right? So you're reading comics and you're just reading comics and you don't know an Archie comic from a Captain America comic. And then when you do know, the best people doing it are, Alan Moore, Frank Miller, Chris Claremont, Walt Simonson. Okay. And then it's like, oh my God. I go to the comic shop and they're like, The New Gods graphic novel. And I'm like, huh? Oh, okay. I could not make sense. What the hell is this? What is this? Right?
Yeah.
But what's funny is, and this is actually what's fun though about comics and comics continuity is Paul Levitt's. Speaking of Paul Levitz's Legion of Superheroes, right?
I was just going to say that because that was the missing link in everything you said, because I recently hunted down the Great Darkness
saga, which I loved.
Yes, I found the hardcover at Jim Hanley's a couple of months ago.
That was my jam. Right. So
almost as overwritten as Chris Claremont, though.
Well,
I'm reading it now. I'm like, these panels are jammed with text.
But it's funny. So there's a reason why so many. Well, there's two reasons. One of which is for intellectual property reasons. People don't want to give Marvel and DC their own intellectual property. But aside from that, there's a reason why people like Grant Morrison and Matt Fraction and other people can go back and mine those comics for more and more stories, because they were just throwing ideas off in a panel. Oh. Like, that's a whole, like, whoa, wait, what? What'd you say about Timberwolf? Timberwolf did what now? Like, that's a whole thing. We have to, but so I actually miss the overwrittenness of it, because, again, going back to Jim Starlin and Dreadstar, like, it signaled a kind of world building, a kind of like, I have, and it's one of the things I've really liked about Ta-Nehisi's run on Black Panther is the world building, right? Like, he's throwing ideas out, and I'm like, right, but he's also throwing ideas out because he's not worried about, having a hit with an original graphic novel and having that be the thing that makes his career, right? So because he doesn't have that concern, he just throws a whole bunch of ideas into the work. And I'm like, I love this, right? Because, and I think that, in the same way that authors are still mining the Paul Levitz Legion, they're still mining, Walt Simonson's Thor, they're still mining all of these comics, they're going to be mining Ta-Nehisi's Black Panther, because so many characters, so much original IP that he's just, I'm sure obviously he's very well compensated.
Yeah. And like you said, another career that he could fall back on.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried writing for the comics?
I've had.
Or is that about to fill you with rage or something? No,
it's not. No. It's not about to fill me with rage. It's honestly, I've had a couple of opportunities to like submit scripts and things, and it just sort of freaks me out. Like, it's almost like it's almost like if you're really good on a computer simulator and they're like, okay, great, now fly this plane. And you're like, right, what? And so, yeah, so I have had a couple of people say, hey, you should do a sample script. You should do it this. You should do it that. And what I've actually done is I've done a couple of like little screenplay ideas. I don't know why that seems more comfortable to me than comics, which I know comics better, but for some reason, I think because I know it so well, it's I don't know, it's kind of intimidating. Yeah. So
no, I get exactly where you're coming from. That's what I was wondering. If it was I like reading these. I don't think I should be the guy in charge of characters who I otherwise adore. But
right,
yeah. We got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem with professors is that professors overthink everything, and so it's just like where someone else will be like, "Oh, sure, let me crack this out and get back to you in 6 weeks." I'm like overthinking it, and it's just like, okay, this is clearly not the thing. So.
Yeah. Understood. Jonathan, thanks for the hour. It is my sincere hope you and I get to shoot the breeze in the after time when we're able to actually sit down in person again. Because
well, someone said on Twitter, they said, what if this is the best timeline? And I was like, and then one of the responses was like, so you mean we're fighting zombies in the other timeline? Like, yeah. And then there's another timeline where the aliens have come down, and it's not ET aliens, it's the aliens from Alien. It's just like, oh God, right? Like,
I'm still voting Giant Asteroid 2020. I'm perfectly fine with that.
Yeah.
I know. And that was Jonathan W. Gray. You can look him up through the CUNY website, but it's easier to check him out on Twitter and then follow his links out from there. He's on Twitter as Elm City Tree, which is ELMCITYTREE, all one word. He's also on Instagram by that handle, but it's a private account, so don't push your luck. Now, you can find his first book, Civil Rights in the White Literary Imagination, Innocence by Association, at good bookstores. And as you guessed from the course of this conversation, I cannot wait to check out his next one, Illustrating the Race, Representing Blackness in American Comics. Now, in the before time, this is when I would mention my Patreon and PayPal and how you guys can support the podcast. But we're living in a different world now. And frankly, I don't need the financial support. The costs for the show are way down. My day job is still paying me pretty well. So that stuff is all covered. If you do want to support by dropping me a note sometime, letting me know what you do and don't like about the podcast, that would be great. But otherwise, if you can spare anything, give to people in need. There are a lot of artists and writers and non-artists and writers, just normal people who are in a lot of need right now between the pandemic and the protests and the resulting police violence. There are Patreons, GoFundMes, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, tip jars, whatever that you can donate to. There are also charities if you're not comfortable giving to individuals. Local food banks, freedom funds, bail funds. There's going to be a shit ton of attorney's fees that come up for a lot of the arrests that resulted from the protests. So what I'm saying is there are people in need, and if you're in a position to help them, then do me a favor and help them. Now, as far as the only Gil-related thing I do like to talk about here, I have started mailing out copies of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, and it's free. If you want it, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up that way. You can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want, but this isn't a money-making thing. It's just me sharing my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY, the number 4, TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.